Hi everyone, in this video, we are going to focus on how the military established political control over Japan. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to answer this question. How did the military government consolidate its political control over Japan? As we go through the lesson, don't just memorize the events. Always ask yourself, how did this strengthen military control? Secondly, did Japan benefit from militarist rule? These are key critical thinking skills. Let's first remind ourselves of what happened before this. Earlier, we learned that many Japanese lost confidence in the civilian government. Why? By the 1920s and early 1930s, civilian politicians were seen as weak, divided, and corrupt. At the same time, the military gained popularity, especially after its successful invasion of Manchuria in 1931. Many Japanese believed that while politicians only argued among themselves, the military was bringing glory back to Japan. After Prime Minister Inukai was assassinated in 1932, a new cabinet was appointed. Admiral Saito Makoto became the prime minister. In his cabinet, there were 10 military officers but only 5 civilians. This tells us something important. The military was now controlling political power. This marked the beginning of militarist rule. How did the military strengthen or consolidate its control in the government? The first way the military strengthened its control was by expanding its influence inside the government itself. Previously, many important government positions were reserved for civilian politicians. However, by 1934, military officers were allowed to occupy these positions. This meant that military leaders were no longer just commanding soldiers. They were now helping to run the country. The military also took over responsibility for important areas such as foreign affairs in Manchukuo, previously Manchuria. So, why did nobody stop them? There were two main reasons. Firstly, civilian politicians were too divided by party politics. Instead of working together, they spent much of their time arguing with one another. Secondly, the military enjoyed strong public support because of its victories overseas. As such, many Japanese felt proud of the army. As a result, many people accepted the military taking on a bigger political role. The second method was to remove anyone who could oppose the military. In 1935, the government, populated by the military, introduced something known as the Campaign of Electoral Purification. At first glance, it sounds positive. It claimed to remove corruption from politics. But in reality, it was used to eliminate people and ideas that the military disliked. Groups promoting socialism and communism were targeted. Political opposition gradually disappeared. As democracy became less meaningful, fewer people even bothered to vote. Think about the consequence. If there are no opposition parties and no competing political ideas, then the military no longer needs to worry about being challenged. With the removal of political opponents, the military achieved greater political control. However, what was the trade-off? The Japanese lost their freedom to express different political opinions, especially those that may be contrary to the military government. Although the military was becoming stronger, it wasn't united. There were actually two rival groups. The first group was the Imperial Way faction, also known as Kodoha. The second group was the Control faction, or Toseiha. Both wanted Japan to become stronger, but they disagreed on how this should happen. The Imperial Way faction believed that Japan should return to traditional samurai values and allow the emperor to rule more directly. The Control faction believed that war with Western countries was inevitable. Therefore, Japan should modernize its military and its economy to prepare for future conflict. This rivalry eventually exploded. On February 26, 1936, members of the Imperial Way faction launched a coup. They attempted to assassinate key government leaders, overthrow the existing government, and establish a new one. It also wanted a Showa restoration, restoring the power of the emperor and improve the lives of ordinary Japanese. However, the coup failed, and even the emperor himself condemned the coup. Without the emperor's support, the rebellion quickly collapsed. Many rebel leaders were arrested and executed. So, what was the political impact? The Imperial Way faction disappeared. The Control faction became the dominant force within the military. Instead of weakening the military, this incident actually made it more united. There were now no longer major internal rivals. Now, instead of disunity within the military, the Control faction now had a strong grip over the military and the government. The Control faction, led by General Tojo, believed strongly that Japan must prepare for an inevitable war with the West. This is an area which we will discuss in further detail when we talk about the outbreak of World War II in the Asia Pacific. With a strong grip over the government, the Control faction began to further expand and modernize the Japanese military. By 1937, Prince Kono became prime minister. The military's influence continued to grow. In July 1937, Japan invaded China. Military officers entered even more government departments. The Cabinet Planning Office was created with military participation. Japan's finances also came increasingly under military control. Then, in 1941, General Tojo Hideki became prime minister. By this point, the military had effectively taken control over the Japanese government. Let's summarize. So, how did the military establish total political control? There were three main methods which we have talked about. First, the military expanded its influence throughout the government. Secondly, they eliminated political opponents through campaigns like electoral purification. Third, they removed internal rivals after the failed February 26 incident. Together, these three developments gave military complete political dominance. Was this beneficial? Well, let's evaluate. There were certainly some benefits. Compared to the earlier civilian governments, Japan was definitely more politically stable. Military victories also created national pride and united many Japanese. However, there were also significant disadvantages. Democracy declined, political freedom disappeared. People who disagreed with the government were no longer able to express themselves openly. So here's the evaluation question I'd like you to think about. Was political stability worth sacrificing democracy and freedom? Well, there isn't one correct answer. What's more important is that you are able to explain your reasoning using evidence. In the next video, we'll examine how the military established economic control over Japan and whether these policies benefited Japan's economy. Hi everyone, welcome back. In the previous video, we look at how the military established political control over Japan. In this video, we will examine how they gain economic control. By the end of the lesson, you should be able to answer this question. How did the military government establish economic control over Japan? As always, don't just memorize the policies. For every example, ask yourself, how did this increase government's control over Japan's economy? In addition, consider as well whether these developments were beneficial to Japan. Before we begin, let's quickly recap what Japan's economy looked like before the military took over. During the 1920s, Japan experienced several economic problems such as severe inflation, economic hardship in the countryside, and the banking crisis. Then came the Great Depression. Farmers struggled because crop prices collapsed. Many families could not repay their debts. Small businesses also suffered. Many Japanese blamed the civilian government for failing to solve these problems. People wanted a government that could rebuild the economy. How did the military address these economic problems? The first way the military strengthened the economy was through industrialization. Industrialization actually began before the military came to power. However, under militarist rule, the focus changed. Instead of producing more consumer goods such as clothing and household products, Japan focused on heavy industries. Heavy industries included industries such as steel, machinery, chemicals, and weapons manufacturing. Large infrastructure projects like roads, bridges, and railways were also expanded. Why heavy industries? These industries were essential if Japan wanted to build a powerful military. So, although the economy was growing, it was growing in a very specific direction. It was becoming a war economy. In earlier videos, we also talked about the zaibatsus. The zaibatsus were huge family-owned businesses. Examples included Mitsubishi, Nichisu, and Mori. Under the military government, the zaibatsus worked very closely with the military. These companies received many government contracts. For example, they produce chemicals, weapons, and construction materials. They also helped Japan exploit resources from Korea and Manchuria. These resources were important because Japan wanted to become self-sufficient, or what we call autarky. The result? Japan's economy recovered remarkably quickly. In fact, Japan was one of the first major countries to recover from the Great Depression. This was certainly one of the successes of the military government. However, there was a problem. Remember how we talk about the Japanese disliking the civilian government because it was seen as corrupt and biased in favor of the zaibatsus? Well, the military government also believed that the zaibatsus cared too much about profits. Competition between zaibatsus were also seen as wasteful. So, the military decided to take greater control. In 1931, it passed the Principal Industries Control Law. This law allowed companies to form cartels. Now, what exactly is a cartel? A cartel is a group of companies that agree to work together instead of competing. They decide together how much to produce and what prices to charge. This prevented companies from undercutting one another. Initially, the government allowed the zaibatsus to manage these cartels, but gradually the government itself became more involved. By 1936, the military government went one step further. The electric power industry came under direct government control. Then, in 1937, the government introduced 5-year plans. These plans set production targets for different industries. Now notice what was happening. Instead of businesses deciding what to produce based on maximizing profits, the government was deciding. Instead of businesses deciding how much to produce, the government was deciding. So now every new policy increased the military's control over the economy. The economy no longer served private businesses. It now served the needs of the states. Do you think this was beneficial for Japan? Just a little extension about cartels. Do they still exist? Do they exist in Singapore? Yes, some of your parents may have remarked about how petrol pump prices are all raised at the same time, and the petrol prices in Singapore are more or less similar, regardless of brand. This is because petrol companies are cartels that agree to work together instead of competing. They decide together how much to produce and what prices to charge. This prevented companies from undercutting one another. Can you think of other examples of cartels? What further questions might you have about cartels? The next policies involved workers. During the 1920s, labor unions or trade unions were encouraged. Their role was to protect workers' rights. For example, they negotiated for better wages and working conditions. However, the military government saw labor unions as troublesome. Why? This was because the workers could organize strikes and protest against government policies. So in 1936, thousands of government workers were forced to leave their unions. Without strong unions, workers had much less bargaining power. From the government's perspective, this meant fewer strikes and fewer disruptions. Factories could continue producing the equipment needed for Japan's military expansion. Again, notice the theme. The government increased its control, but workers lost some of their rights. Finally, let's look at the countryside. The Great Depression hit the farmers especially hard. Many were heavily in debt. The government introduced the campaign for economic revitalization. Its aim was to improve rural life. Farmers were encouraged to cooperate with one another. They were also taught more scientific farming methods to increase crop yields. The government even shared successful examples to encourage participations. Did these policies help? Well, to a certain extent, yes, but overall improvements were limited. Why? This was because the government's main priority remained focused on industrialization and military expansion. Thus, most of its resources continued flowing into heavy industries rather than agriculture. So let's summarize. So how did the military establish economic control? There are 4 main methods. First, they promoted industrialization that was focused on heavy industries. Second, they controlled the zaibatsus through principles industries control law and later direct government intervention. Third, they weakened labor unions to prevent opposition from workers. Finally, they tried to improve rural areas, although with limited success. Together, these policies allowed the military government to direct almost every major part of Japan's economy. Now, was economic control beneficial? Well, there were obviously some benefits. Japan recovered very quickly from the Great Depression. Heavy industries expanded rapidly. The economy became stronger than before. The government also reduced destructive competitions between zaibatsus. However, there were also significant disadvantages. Because the government focused heavily on heavy industries, fewer consumer goods were produced. Ordinary Japanese experienced shortages. The workers also lost protection previously provided by the labor unions. Farmers remained poor because agriculture was not the government's priority. So, here's the question I would like you to think about. Was Japan's economic recovery worth sacrifices made by the workers and farmers? A strong evaluation recognizes both sides. Yes, Japan recovered economically, but much of their recovery was designed to prepare the country for war rather than improve the daily lives of the people. Hi everyone, we have now come to the final video about Japan under militarist rule. In the previous two videos, we have seen how the military established political and economic control. In this lesson, we will examine how the military established social control. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to answer this question. How did the military government establish social control over Japan? As we go through today's lesson, please remember one key idea. The military didn't just want to control what people did. They also wanted to control how the people thought, believed, and valued. That was the ultimate goal. Why was social control necessary? Let's understand why the military even bothered to control society. Remember what happened before the military came to power. Many Japanese believed that traditional values were disappearing. Cities were becoming more westernized. People felt society was materialistic and selfish. Many of them blamed the civilian government for allowing Japan to lose its traditional identity. As such, the military believed Japan needed to return to traditional Japanese values. But there was another reason. If everyone believed the same things, supported the same government, and obeyed the same leaders, there would be so much less opposition. Therefore, social control helped to strengthen political control as well. The first method was shaping how Japanese people thought. The military promoted values such as loyalty, obedience, patriotism, sacrifice for the nation, loyalty to the emperor. These values appeared everywhere. For example, during the campaign for economic revitalization, the government praised the hardworking farmers living simple lives in the countryside. Rural life was presented as the ideal Japanese way of life. Women were also praised for fulfilling their traditional roles as wives, mothers, and homemakers. Notice what the government was doing. It wasn't forcing the people through violence. Instead, it was influencing what people believed was good and honorable. If everyone accepted these values, they would naturally support the government. The government also wanted workers to think differently. In 1937, discussion councils were introduced in workplaces. Managers and workers met together to solve problems. At first, this sounds like a good idea, but notice the message workers were taught. Companies were described as one big family. Everyone had a duty to work together under the emperor. Workers were encouraged to avoid conflict. Instead of demanding higher wages or going on strike, they were expected to sacrifice for the good of the nation. This wasn't just about productivity. This was also about changing how the workers thought about their responsibilities. The more obedient workers became, the easier it was for the government to maintain control. Another method was censorship. If the government wants everyone to think the same way, what happens to ideas that disagree with the government? Right, they had to be removed. This was exactly what happened. The government closely monitored newspapers, books, magazines, and films. Anything that criticized the emperor or the military were censored. In 1936, the Information and Propaganda Committee was established to strengthen control over the media. Only information that supported the military were allowed. Negative reports disappeared. Censorship wasn't just limited to newspapers. The military also established a special police force known as the Kampertai. Its job was to investigate people who opposed the government. Individuals with socialist or communist ideas could be arrested. Some were imprisoned, others lost their jobs. Many people became too frightened to express their opinions openly. Even if they disagreed with the government, they remained silent. Notice the result. The government didn't need everyone to agree. It only needed people to be afraid to disagree. This was another form of social control. As a result, ordinary Japanese mostly heard one side of the story. This made it much easier for the government to maintain public support. Controlling education is the last method we are discussing today, and this was focused on young people. The military understood something important. If you want long-term control, you needed to shape the next generation. Schools became one of the government's most powerful tools. In 1937, the Ministry of Education published a document called The Fundamentals of Our National Polity. Teachers were instructed to teach traditional Japanese values. Students were taught loyalty to the emperor. They learned that the needs of the nation came before individual interests. Schools also focused on physical training and military-style drills. Subjects such as martial arts became compulsory. The aim was not simply to produce healthy students. The aim was to prepare future soldiers and loyal citizens. Education became another way for the government to influence how the young were taught. So let's summarize. How did the military establish social control? First, it promoted traditional values that encouraged obedience and loyalty. Secondly, it censored ideas that challenged the government. Third, it used education to shape future generations. Although these methods look different, they all had the same objectives: total control. Was social control beneficial? Let's finish by evaluating these policies. As usual, there are benefits. Traditional values help to unite the Japanese people. People develop a stronger sense of national identity. Loyalty to the emperor created unity during difficult times. However, there were also serious disadvantages. Freedom of speech disappeared. People were afraid to express different opinions. The media no longer reported freely. Education became a tool for propaganda instead of encouraging independent thinking. Before we end, consider the question posed in the slide. Do ends justify the means? Can sacrifice, such as the loss of freedom of expression and a climate of fear, be a suitable price to pay for unity and control in order to build a strong Japan? I hope this video has been helpful for you in looking at how the military established total control in all aspects of Japan's life. Lastly, consider whether military rule was beneficial to Japan. Thank you.